Welcome back. So let's talk a little about procedural versus substantive rationality. Procedural rationality means that you do things in a certain way because that's what the regulation says. You follow the regulation to the letter. If you say, can I do this or can I not do this? You know, if the answer is the regulation says you can do it, then you do it. If the regulation says you can't do it, then you can't do it, right? And a lot of times regulations are written like for safety purposes, okay? Maybe you have to use a piece of heavy machinery in a certain way to keep you from chopping off your hand, right? So the regulation describes all the things you need to do to keep from chopping off your hand. Now, substantive rationality asks, what is the spirit of the regulation? And even if I'm, may or may not be breaking regulation, is there a way that I can better adhere to the spirit, right? So you think about this like getting your hands chopped off in a piece of heavy machinery. Well, let's say that I do a little research and I find that somebody that I'm working with, let's say, here's a good example. This is one I can relate, I can tell you from personal experience. So when I was in the Army, there was some obscure regulation that said when you were working with tools, you had to use heavy leather gloves to protect your hands. But some of the people I was working with were using power tools like spinning saws, and see, if the spinning saw catches on the glove, it'll pull your whole hand in there and chop it off, right? So even though the regulation said you needed to wear gloves, everyone agreed to disobey regulation because of substantive rationality. Because let's face it, you can follow the rules by wearing the leather glove like the regulation says and possibly risk losing your hand, or you can reduce the risk of injuries altogether by not wearing gloves. Okay? So here's some examples of procedural and substantive rationality in the vignette called Civic Associations Taking Charge. It starts on page 63. And I'm going to just read a couple of these things. Anders Malmqvist says, we could not communicate with each other, but now we realize that we all organize the work in a similar manner. Then he goes on. He says, we asked ourselves, what do we need? We need to establish a central where we can collect information and coordinate resources. We must open the petrol station to secure petrol and reparations, and we need to make sure that everyone working can eat at least every 4 hours. Okay, that's important. Now, here's the problem. They couldn't get a fuel truck. So they said something. They said, I know we broke some regulations and maybe a law or two to get what we needed, but what could we do? I mean, we said we need a fuel tanker, and they, the municipalities, responded, you can't get a fuel tanker because you are not allowed to keep a fuel tanker there. So we made some calls, and 6 hours later we had a fuel tanker. A farmer who seemingly had nothing to do with this decided to put his fuel tanker there. These kinds of solutions were typical, right? You can't work. You need the fuel tanker so that you can make sure that there's power for the work, and you need to make sure that people need to eat. That was more important than the specific regulation in the context of a hurricane, because those regulations were written for routine, everyday kinds of situations, not for hurricane kinds of situations. So they embraced substantive rationality. And again, the social capital you kind of see is starting to develop. And they mention on page 64 this term, they call it a hidden in local culture, successfully revealed itself in a kind of gemeinschaft, a collective mentality, kind of almost a societal way of thinking. They were willing to work with each other, that the safety of the collective became more important than individual regulations. That's where we get the substantive rationality. In the next video, we're going to talk about ambidextrous organizations, as in with both hands. Organizations that turn out that they can handle routine and exceptional circumstances. Hope you're enjoying this discussion. Give me a thumbs up if you like it. Make sure you subscribe and comment down below. And by the way, let me ask all of you a question. Which do you think is more important? Procedural rationality, substantive rationality, and why? Great. I'll see you in the next video.